Hello and welcome to episode 5 of Shooting the Breeze, the formal gun podcast of WaltInPA.com. And naturally, with a website entitled WaltInPA.com, I am your host, Walt White, here to discuss guns. Now, this episode is a little early. It's not quite planned out and scripted as usual. Well, although I shouldn't say scripted because the shows are never scripted. I just make some general notes and run with it. But this particular episode didn't have all of the notes ready for it. And the reason being, this is being recorded a few days earlier than I normally do. And it all started out this morning. I got up bright and early, I went outside, I started working in the yard, and I totally lost track of time. Before I knew it, I was out there for 6 or so hours. I really run down and just beat. I came in the house, I got cleaned up, and I just sort of plopped into the sofa and just melted and started dozing. And my wife asked me, what my plans were for today. Apparently, her sister, my sister-in-law, just got a new puppy or adopted a new puppy, and she wanted to go down and see the puppy. So I'm just kind of sitting there thinking, I don't mind playing with a new puppy, but I don't really want to drive all the way down there. So I said, you know what, all I kind of want to do right now is grab something to eat, have a cigar, get something to drink, and just head downstairs. And I'll sit in my office, I'll listen to some podcasts, I'll do something just to kind of unwind. And she says, okay, well, I'm going to go see the puppy, and off she went. And here I am. Rather than sit and listen to podcasts, I thought, you know what, this is a perfect opportunity for me to record my own, episode 5. So here I am, and here's the little backstory that goes along with the episode, and I'm totally using that for an excuse if this episode bombs, and if everything totally gets off track. So with that said, let's head into the news. Alright, well, this week there are a couple of interesting news articles that I want to share with you. 2 of them came from one particular website called the Daily Caller, and the other one, for whatever reason, I lost it and I couldn't find it, and it took me quite a while to find it again. But it's kind of interesting, and I really thought it was worth digging out. So here is the first news article, and this, as I said, comes from the Daily Caller, and this was published through the Associated Press, and it's entitled, "Grandma's Packing More Than Just Tissues." Now, the article goes on to say, a grandmother who says she wants to carry a gun with her when she brings her grandchildren to a park near her Hammond, Indiana home filed a lawsuit Monday with hopes of challenging city law, which currently bans carrying a firearm into a public park. Michelle Boss, a licensed gun owner, lives within a block of the Hammond Park which she wishes to bring her firearm to, the Northwest Indiana Times reports. Another plaintiff in the lawsuit, student Samuel Dykstra, also is a licensed gun carrier who wants to see Hammond's ban dismantled. The lawsuit is seeking class action status. The city's gun ban, according to an AP report, is on the books despite the Indiana General Assembly this year passing a law allowing registered gun owners to carry their firearm inside public buildings that do not hold a court. Hammond City Council this month turned down a proposal to loosen up its gun regulations in alignment with state law, though the city's mayor, Thomas McDermott Jr., has said that he doesn't plan to enforce the existing ban. In addition to seeking damages for gun owners, the lawsuit also is pushing for a court order for the city to either repeal or amend their ordinances to comply with the newly approved state law, the Northwest Indiana Times reports. So here's an interesting, a really interesting news report because it takes a different spin on things. Here we have a grandmother. When I read this article, I conjure up the image of my grandmother. She's in her 60s. She likes to play with her grandchildren. She likes to be outside and spend time outdoors. And she wants to take her grandchildren to the park. And she feels safe carrying her gun. And the park has signage that says she's not permitted to do that, even though is it the mayor that says that he's not. Yeah, the city mayor, Thomas McDermott Jr., said that he's not looking to enforce the ban. It's kind of there, but just trust us. We're not going to enforce it. And while that may be true, I can just see this mayor getting out of office, being replaced by another one down the line, and this guy saying, you know what, I'm going to enforce everything on the books, and he slaps someone for carrying a gun in the park, and it causes a huge problem, and ultimately, because the city ban violates state law, you've got a civil case that's going to crop up, and the city's going to be making a payout because there's no way around it. The state says you're not permitted to make your own gun laws. Well, I don't know how it exactly works here, but in the state of Pennsylvania, the state determines what you can and can't do with firearms in regards to carrying and buying, selling, things like that. So, when in the case of Pennsylvania, when these little towns or cities decide to make up their own rules, it causes a real problem because it's a rights violation. So it's interesting how this works, and I really like the angle that they took, conjuring up the image of the grandmother, because that's taking a different spin on it. Now, the picture that goes along with this article does no good for it, as far as I'm concerned. It's a picture of the back of an individual walking down the road. In his right hand is a gun, so he's walking down the road carrying a gun, just carrying it in his hand like it's a totally natural thing. And while the image of the grandmother, I think, strengthens the article, the picture of this guy walking down the street with a gun just totally hurts it. Totally combative images as far as I'm concerned. So, kind of interesting. I'm curious to see where it's going to go. If it comes down to it, hey, I hope the civil lawsuit goes through, or the class action suit goes through, and the city's forced to comply, even if they decide that they're not going to enforce it. It's just not a good idea to I don't know, maybe I should be putting on my tinfoil hat at this point, but I don't trust the government that says, trust us, we're not going to enforce this particular law, so totally disregard it. And that's, if you're not going to enforce it, get it off the books. So there was news article 1. Let's roll right into news article 2. Alright, now it's time to take a look at news article 2, and this one again comes from the Daily Caller, and this is written by Chris Cox, and it was published on August 30th, 2011, and the article is entitled "Your Right to Self-Defense Shouldn't End at State Borders." And the article goes on to say, this Labor Day weekend, many families will pack up the car for one last road trip to the beach, lake, or park before summer ends. Unfortunately, many of them will have to check their right to self-defense at the state border. Thankfully, there is legislation making its way through Congress that could fix this. The bill is the National Right to Carry Reciprocity Act, H.R. 822. And it would allow any person with a valid state-issued concealed firearm permit to exercise their right to carry a firearm in any other state that affords that right to its own residents. The bill was introduced by Congressman Cliff Stearns, Republican of Florida, and Heath Shuler, Democrat, North Carolina, and it currently has 242 co-sponsors and the full backing of the National Rifle Association. By any benchmark, H.R. 822 has an overwhelming bipartisan support. Currently, 49 states have laws that permit concealed carry in some form or another. In all but 8 of those states, the average law-abiding citizen can carry a firearm without having to navigate an overly restrictive and in some cases intentionally impossible bureaucratic process. Only the state of Illinois completely forbids its citizens from carrying concealed firearms outside their homes and workplaces. The problem is that interstate recognition of these various permits is not uniform. Some states have broad laws in place that liberally recognize permit holders from other states. Other states are more restrictive, and still others refuse to recognize any state's permit but their own. This can create issues for travelers. The national right to Carry Act would solve this problem by requiring the various states that allow concealed carry to recognize each other's permits, much in the same way that they recognize each other's driver's licenses. Imagine if America treated state driver's license the same way they treat the right to carry, and every time you drove across a state line you weren't sure if you were allowed to legally operate a vehicle in that state. If you knew you weren't allowed to operate a vehicle in a certain state, you simply couldn't drive there. There are some who agree with the spirit of H.R. 822, but are concerned that it would create a federal gun licensing system. This is simply not true. The bill explicitly protects the right to each state to issue its own permits and determine its own rules and regulations with regard to concealed carry, such as where carrying is permitted or prohibited and where it is allowed. This is similar to how one highway can have different speed limits depending on the state in which you're driving. You can drive on the highway regardless of which state you're from, but you are required to obey each state's basic rules of the road. Others have voiced concern that H.R. 822 would violate the 10th Amendment right of every state to make its own laws. Again, this is not the case. The Second Amendment guarantees the fundamental individual right of every law-abiding citizen to bear arms. This is an inalienable right that neither the federal government nor any state government may infringe upon. And in fact, the 14th Amendment gives Congress the power to protect citizens from state infringement of their own constitutional rights. Our basic right to self-defense has been recognized in law for centuries. We shouldn't be forced to forfeit these rights at the state line. Call your representative today and ask if he or she is a co-sponsor of H.R. 822. If the answer is yes, please thank them and urge them to do what they can to push this bill forward. If the answer is no, then please urge them to become a co-sponsor today and to support your fundamental right to defend yourself and your loved ones, regardless of which state you happen to be passing through. And that is the end of the article. And I thought this was pretty good because up until this point, I was kind of concerned about the national carry talk that was making the rounds, because my concern was that everything would be equalized. The federal government would step in and say, okay, these are the new requirements for permits, licenses, concealed carry, open carry, things like that, and it would overrule the state's guidelines, and that kind of concerned me a lot because I'm in a state that is shall issue. As long as I am not prohibited, I don't have felony convictions, I wasn't what's the word? I totally can't think of the word. But as long as I'm not permitted, or I was not put into a mental institution or a rehab center without consent, like if I was committed, that's the word, then I'm not permitted. But if I pass the guidelines and I pass the background check, I can get a license to carry firearms while I wait. And in the county in which I live, Berks County, we do that quite often. It is a while you wait county. You go into the courthouse, the sheriff's office is in the courthouse, you bring in your paperwork, your money, you give it to them, they take your picture, they do the background check, and within a few minutes, last I heard, about 15 minutes, you're out the door with your license and you're good to go. Back when I got mine, it was before they did the while you wait thing. So I went in, I dropped off the paperwork, I left. Within 2 weeks, I had almost like a camera card for Pennsylvania state driver's license is the same way. You pay for everything, and then you get a camera card in the mail. You take the camera card back, they take your picture, and then you've got your license. Different counties are different throughout the state. Some make you jump through hoops, like Delaware County, from what I understand, and others, like Berks County, are just fantastic about it. You go in, you get your license, and you're out the door in 15, 20 minutes. So I was concerned about losing all of that, and it looks like from this article that really isn't the case. So it was a fear that really there was no need in fearing. Another thing that kind of is interesting about this article is I was recently traveling, and I was up in New York. I had to leave my gun at home. My Pennsylvania license is not accepted in New York State. So it was just, I felt naked the entire weekend because I carry a gun more or less everywhere I go. Anywhere that I'm permitted to carry a gun, I have a gun on me. And now that I have this Smith & Wesson Bodyguard, this pocket pistol, I mean, it's a no-brainer. Instead of strapping on the XD subcompact, which is small, I just toss this little gun in my pocket, and I can run to the store to pick up a gallon of milk or something, and it's easy, you know. It's fantastic having the option of tossing a little pistol in your pocket. So it kind of sucked going up to New York and not being able to carry. You know, my pocket's empty. The gun is not on my hip where it usually is. I feel kind of weird not having it, and it made me a little uneasy. So something like this going through would be really interesting, or would be great, I think, just as long as the federal government does not take it a bit too far. Because I've also heard that there are situations where if the federal government takes over and starts handling these licenses to carry or these permits to carry, they can also take away that right. So there was some mumblings, you know, around the different forums that I read and stuff. So it's nice to see this laying out things and making the picture more clear. I didn't read the bill, although I probably should, but I like what I hear in this article, and you probably should too if you're a carry person. Alright, well, it is time for the last piece of the news. Now, the most important part of this, as far as I'm concerned, or the most interesting part of this particular news article, is the video embedded inside the news article. Now, I don't know how this works. I don't want to take this video and plop it on the screen right up here, because it's video. It's not like I'm taking a snapshot of the news article like I've done in the past, which is perfectly fine because I'm just taking a picture of what I would see on the browser. So I'm going to have to tell you to go look at this particular video. I will include it in the show notes so that you can watch it and see what I'm talking about. But this particular news article has made the rounds. I've seen it in a variety of places, and it's all about a New Mexico governor. The title of the article, which varies from article to article, is New Mexico governor gets perfect score on renewal of her concealed carry permit. Now, this article goes on to say, Santa Fe, New Mexico's pistol-packing governor is a sure shot. Governor Susana Martinez received perfect scores on her recertification for her concealed carry permit over the weekend in Las Cruces. She scored 100% with both 380 and 38 and 45 caliber handguns, her staff said. Martinez's permit to carry a concealed handgun, originally obtained in 2009, was extended for another 2 years. She was a district attorney and a Republican candidate for governor when she first went through training and qualified to carry a concealed weapon. Her spokesman, Greg Blair, said Martinez's personal and professional experiences motivated her to arm herself. Not only was she a prosecutor, but her husband, Chuck Franco, was undersheriff of Donna Ana County. Since she and Chuck both made careers out of taking on dangerous and violent criminals, she decided to get her concealed carry permit for personal protection, especially when traveling alone or at night on the campaign trail, Blair said. As governor, Martinez has a security detail, but she still chooses to carry a weapon, Blair said. One of Martinez's Republican colleagues, Governor Rick Perry of Texas, has also carried a handgun. Perry last year used his laser-sighted pistol to shoot a coyote that he said was threatening his dog during a morning jog near Austin. Santa Fe Bureau Chief Milan Simonich can be reached. The information on the article itself that wasn't actually part of the news clip, but the news article just tells you kind of what's going on, and the video itself is the most interesting part. So we've got the governor who's moving through stages. You can hear her shooting. I've got the video playing. It's really short. It's about 23 seconds, and basically there's no real reason for you to hear the shots and stuff, but basically it appears as though it's set up like an IDPA or a USPSA match, where there are two tables or two stages, and the governor shoots from each table. She's shooting at steel targets, that are set up. It looks like around a berm. You really can't see much. It looks like it was taken with a camera phone or a digital camera. There really isn't a big wide field of view so that you can see everything that's going on. It's basically just the governor moving from one stage to the next and shooting these targets. And she seems to be doing pretty well. It's not, you know, the IDPA or USPSA style shooting that you see where you've got the person with a really aggressive stance, leaning forward, taking their shots, moving quickly. You know, she just she sits upright, she's leaning back a little bit, she's got the gun out, she's taking her shots, she's taking her time, and she gets a perfect score. Now, the part of the article that tripped me up was, this article says both .380 and .45 caliber handguns. I thought I read somewhere that, or I'm sorry, this article says .38 and .45. So I'm assuming revolver and .45 pistol. Now, I read other articles that had a 0 at the end of the .38, making it .380, which generally tells me a .380 auto, little pocket pistol. So I'm not quite sure what she was shooting. I guess I could dig around and find out more about it, but it's I don't know. It's not really important news, but I thought it was pretty cool that we've got a governor that is out there qualifying, much like everyone else in the state, to carry a concealed weapon, and she did well. She scored a perfect score. That's awesome. So that is the last piece of news. Not that the last piece was really any news. It was just kind of, hey, it's interesting, we should check this out. But that is the last piece of news that I've got for you, and that is going to close out segment 1 of the Shooting the Breeze podcast. So when I come back, we're going to take a look at featured content, which I mixed up a little bit this week. I've got a different idea in mind. So I'm going to take a little break, relight my cigar because it probably needs a touch-up, and maybe refresh my drink, and I'll be right back. Alright, well, it is time for featured content. This is segment 2 of the Shooting the Breeze podcast. I'm not quite sure why I tell you which segment we're in. It's not like I break this show up and give you piece by piece by piece. It's all one show. But in case you were wondering, this is the part of my notes where it says segment 2. And this is generally where I feature content. Now, in the past, I've taken blog posts or podcasts, things like that, and I featured one particular instance, one particular blog post, one particular podcast or video or whatever, and then I talked about it. I built on it a little bit, and we went from there. This time around, I want to do something a little different, and the reason being is I've listened to a lot of podcasts this particular week. Since the past episode, I've listened to 11 of one, 4 of another, 3 of another, and I just started another podcast. So, I mean, I've been doing a lot of earbud time and listening to a lot of different podcasts. And I wanted to feature 3 of those podcasts. And, you know, we'll talk about each one and discuss some of the things that I've heard and why you should check them out and things like that. So, with that said, let's roll right into that. And the first podcast I'm going to talk about is the Road Gunner podcast. Now, I should probably pull up the website so I can reference things, but I came across this particular podcast on the Gun Rights Radio Network forum. I was in there reading a lot of stuff like usual, and it just happened to pop up in the new posts section. And this is a new podcast to the Gun Rights Radio Network, and the tagline is coming at you with 80,000 pounds of concealed carry. The Road Gunner podcast is run by the unnamed trucker. He does not talk about who he is because his services are leased to a trucking company which frowns upon him carrying. So he keeps his identity hidden, and he discusses the things you would encounter carrying a gun on the road, and he's on the road a lot. Now, in an earlier article, I mentioned that it's really hard, or in the news section, I mentioned that it's really hard to travel from state to state without having a broad range of permits, which allow you to enter different states under different permits and non-resident permits and things like that. So, it's really interesting that he's got a variety of permits, and he needs to understand the law of a variety of states because he's doing long-haul trucking, and he's covering a lot of road. And the podcast has some really interesting stuff in it. The first 4 episodes that I listened to, the first one was just the premiere podcast telling you what the podcast is all about, and all of the episodes run about a half an hour. The second episode talked about IDPA matches, which was pretty cool. The third episode just talks about comparing defensive driving to carrying a gun and how you can use different conditions to analyze what's going on, and I thought that was really interesting. And the fourth podcast that I listened to, or actually I didn't get to the fourth podcast yet. That is on my list of things to listen to really soon. So I listened to the first 3. I really enjoyed the podcast. I thought it was great. He did an interview with a gun shop owner, and he opened my eyes to a new holster company that I wasn't aware of. So I looked them up, and that looks pretty cool. And so far, everything is presented in a very positive way, and I like the format of the show. It's very interesting, and I would strongly suggest you check it out if you're into gun podcasts. And obviously you've got to be in the gun podcast. I mean, you're listening to one now, or you're watching one now, so it's kind of a no-brainer. Go check out the Unnamed Trucker for the Road Gunner podcast and see what he has to offer. The 3 episodes that I listened to, I did those all in one sitting. I was working from home, and I just blasted through the 3 of them, and I thought it was really good stuff. They're in manageable bites in about a half hour, 40 minutes, something like that. So you can do a lot of listening in a fairly short period of time. I mean, I really like long podcasts, and the one I do is about an hour long. But being able to do like a half an hour chunk at a time is really nice, especially when you're working from home and you've got a daughter that's taking a nap, a 1-year-old daughter that's taking a nap and could be up at any time. Being able to just slip in a podcast is really nice. So check out the Road Gunner and give him a listen. Give him some feedback. Comment on his website. Look him up on the Gun Rates Radio Network forum. Tell him how good of a job he's doing, and become a fan on Facebook. All right, it is time to discuss the second feature podcast of the 3 that I want to talk about in this episode, and that is the Empty Mags podcast, which has a tagline of, "If my mags were full, I'd be out shooting." And with a tagline like that, I mean, how could you not like the podcast? But I came across this. It's a new podcast to the Gun Rights Radio Network, and I saw it on the forums that it was added, and it was on my list of things to check out. I subscribed to the RSS feed, and I was gearing up to start listening to it. However, I didn't really get to it when I initially saw it. And along the lines, the podcaster, Jason Phelps, he followed me on Twitter. And when I saw him follow me, I reciprocated and followed him back. And when I did that, I saw that he had a Google Plus account. So I also added him to a circle in Google Plus, and we started commenting back and forth on different things. And I decided, you know what, I'm talking to this guy every now and again, or fairly often, and he seems like a really cool guy. I'm going to sit down and start listening to his podcast. And I did. He has 11 podcasts available. I am through 10.9. I've listened to episode 11 all but through the last about 10 minutes. I got interrupted this morning, and I paused it and walked away, and since then I've restarted my computer, so I've got to go back through and pick up the podcast where I left off. But this show is very addicting. It's really short. It's 20-30 minutes. I think he's got one that runs about 40 minutes, and really interesting stuff, a variety of topics. Sort of like mine. He touches on some news in the beginning, and then he's got some feature stuff, and it's been interesting stuff. The first episode was the intro to the podcast and some discussion of ARs. Now, I don't own an AR, but by listening to this episode, I wanted an AR even more than I do now. So that episode was really good. The second one I listened to was Eyes and Bodyguards, in which he tells a story about... Actually, I don't know whether this is the podcast where he tells the story or not, but in one of the podcasts, he tells a story about a situation where he walks in on a convenience store being robbed, and the whole the whole story really opens your eyes to what's going on, because I find myself in similar situations where I walk into gas stations that are, they're not really shady gas stations, but they're they're not frequented very often. They're not lit really well. They're kind of off in the middle of nowhere. They're on the way to work. That's why I stopped there. But just a variety of really interesting stuff. I've listened to all 11 episodes. I was planning on going through and talking a little bit about each podcast, but now that I see that I've listened to so many, I'm getting the episodes mixed up. I don't want to go through and botch the episodes and tell you this is talked about in this episode, and then it turns out that, well, that stuff that I was talking about was actually featured in a different episode of the podcast. So I'm not going to run through them like I was going to, but Jason does some really interesting stuff, and he talks about a variety of firearms and his experiences with those, and he's kind of opened my eyes a little bit to revolvers. Now, I've always wanted a revolver, but hearing the one podcast where he talks about Ruger, I want a revolver even more. And it's listening to this podcast, my list of wanted firearms has grown from like this big to like this big. So really good stuff. You should definitely check it out, and give the podcast lots of feedback. Comment on the articles. You can friend him on Google Plus and talk to him there. He's on Twitter at EmptyMags and Eyes Never Closed, I believe. He's got 2 Twitter accounts, and he seems to be very active in the community. He's easy to get a hold of, easy to talk to, and he seems to be a real nice guy to boot. So definitely check out Empty Mags podcast at emptymags.com. All right, it is time to talk about the last podcast that I want to feature, and you're probably sitting there watching this video thinking, okay, Walt, tell us about the next podcast on the Gun Rights Radio Network. I mean, you've discussed 2 already. You're sitting there wearing your brand new fancy Gun Rights Radio Network t-shirt. So let us have it. Well, the next podcast I want to talk about is actually not on the Gun Rights Radio Network. However, thanks to the Gun Rights Radio Network, I discovered this podcast. Now, a few weeks ago, I mentioned that I sat in on a live discussion of the Barstool discussions. And in the chat room, there was a lot of conversation, really interesting stuff. And one of the people in there that I was talking to mentioned his podcast, the Rimfire podcast. And I think he's on about episode 4. I believe there's something like a 10-episode minimum to be a part of the Gun Rights Radio Network, but he's not a part of the network. However, thanks to the network, I was able to discover his podcast, and I started listening. Now, as soon as I started talking to him, I looked him up on iTunes. I added his feed to my RSS reader, and I listened to the first episode, and I don't remember which one it was. I think at the time it was episode 3. So I added that, I listened to that, and then I liked it. So what I did was I burned a couple of episodes to the next podcast disc that I put in my car, and over the last couple of days I listened to episodes 1, 2, and 4, I believe. And it's just been really interesting stuff. I mean, it's all rimfire discussion, and the beautiful thing about rimfire is it's really inexpensive. 550 rounds of .22 long rifle is something like $20 or $22 or something like that. So when he starts talking about rimfire guns, especially in .22, I sit back and I think, wow, he's talking about these guns that are much more affordable than centerfire guns in a lot of cases. And this gun that he's talking about, I could pick one up, I could go to the range, and for $20 I could shoot for a couple of hours. That's fantastic. And he goes over just different guns. It talks about 17, 22 long, short, long rifle, just really interesting stuff. And he's really opened my eyes to the world of .22. The only .22 I have at the moment is my wife's Beretta Neos. I love shooting that gun. It's tremendously inexpensive compared to even 9mm, which is inexpensive, or less expensive than .380 or .40 or .45. But the podcast does some really interesting stuff, and I'm really getting into into .22s. And in one episode, he's talking about conversion kits for ARs and different things that you can do. And I believe there's a conversion kit to turn your Glock into a .22. So there's just really cool stuff that makes shooting much more affordable. And having a podcast that highlights that, I think, is great. He also did an episode where he had an interview with Doc Wesson from Gun Nation. He's also on the Barstool discussion. And that was the longest episode that I listened to, and I think it was about 45 minutes. But really interesting stuff. I cranked the radio up really loud and driving around with the windows open. I must look like some kind of whack job driving through the downtown Reading with, stopped at a stoplight, and I've got two guys talking guns booming from the windows. I've got street traffic walking by giving me these weird looks, but it's a lot of fun, and I really enjoy doing that, and listening to this particular podcast was a nice plus this week. So you should definitely check out the Rimfire podcast, which is hosted by Ken Kowalski. Just kind of had to reference my notes, and I spelled his last name phonetically because I wasn't sure how to spell it, and that really tripped me up in my notes. So 3 podcasts you should definitely check out. Again, give all of them feedback, comment on their sites, tell them how great of a job they're doing, and give them feedback so that they can make their shows better. Well, welcome back, and it is the part of the podcast where I talk a little bit about what I'm smoking and what I'm drinking. And the cigar and beverage pairing is sponsored by StogieReview.com. So before I get to talking about this cigar, let's take a couple of seconds and listen to a word from Brian Hewitt over at StogieReview.com.
Hey, it's Brian here from Stogie Review. If you like cigars, and I'll bet you do, how about you go over and check out StogieReview.com. Just, it's a bunch of guys. We smoke a lot of cigars. We talk about them. We tell you what we think. You can trust me because I'm wearing my thinking glasses. So check it out, StogieReview.com.
Alright, well, let's talk about this cigar that I'm smoking. And I'm getting kind of nervous because I thought I was going to have to pop the band off before I got to this segment, because I'm getting really close to burning the band. But this is an EP Carrillo core line, and this cigar came out probably in the 2010 IPCPR trade show, and the cigar is made by Ernesto Perez Carrillo. Now, Ernesto, or EP Carrillo, got his fame from being the blender for La Gloria Cubana. So if you were a big fan of the La Gloria Cubana Wavels or whatever other sizes, the Wavel was my favorite, or the Serie R or the older La Gloria stuff, then you are familiar with the blending talent of Ernesto Perez Carrillo. And after his contract was up with General, he decided to open his own cigar company, EP Carrillo, and he opened it with his children. And the first release was the inaugural 2009, which was about a $14 cigar. Now, it was a really good cigar, but at $14 it was something that I really didn't smoke very often because it hit the wallet kind of hard. Now, I guess about a year after that was released, he came out with the Core line, which is a more affordable line from him. And it was more mass distributed, and it's just easier to come by. Now, these cigars are medium bodied. They are made in the Dominican Republic. They have a Nicaraguan binder, a filler combination of Dominican Republic and Nicaraguan tobaccos, and the wrapper is Ecuadorian. Again, medium bodied cigar, nice full flavored stick. This particular one was massive. I mean, it was like bigger than my head when I lit it up, and I did that on purpose so that I could get through the entire cigar while I recorded and edited this show on the fly. I don't generally smoke cigars this large. However, I had the time this time. Again, I mentioned earlier on that my wife is out, so the house is nice and quiet. I don't have anything pressing to take care of, and I had plenty of time to just sit back and enjoy a cigar. So if this particular cigar sounds interesting, you should definitely check it out. I don't remember what the price point is, especially on this one, because I really haven't bought any. They come in a variety of sizes, and I think the price ranges from about $6 to maybe $9 a piece. I could be wrong. My preferred retailer to buy these from would be Mike over at Buckhead Cigars in Atlanta, Georgia. He has taken care of me a lot over the last year or so, and especially since my local cigar shop closed. Mike has been my go-to shop at Buckhead. So I'll provide his contact information in the show notes. If you're interested in ordering any of these particular cigars, you can give Mike a call and talk a little business, and maybe get a 5-pack or a box or whatever you want to do, and let him know that Walt sent you. Now, I'm pairing this cigar with a beer, and I haven't bought beer in a little while. After I got done all that yard work that I talked about earlier, I was sitting on the couch and I thought, I could really go for a beer. if I go for a beer, I got to go buy a case, because the way Pennsylvania works, I just can't run to the gas station or the supermarket and pick up a 6-pack. I've got to either go to a store with a liquor license, which is usually like a pizza shop or something like that, and pay gobs of money for a 6-pack, or I've got to go to the beer distributor and buy a case. So I thought, you know what, I'll go get a bottle of Zaya. I really love this stuff. It's rum from Trinidad. It's nice and sweet. It has no bite. It just goes down so smooth. So I get in the car and I start heading to the liquor store, and I get to a stop sign. I'm thinking, you know what, if I drink this stuff while I do the podcast, I'm gonna wind up having a glass of watered down Zaya, because I tend to drink really slow while I'm doing these recordings and stuff. So I thought, you know what, maybe I really could go for a case of beer. It would be cheaper than buying a bottle of Zaya at $40. So I hang a right and I go down to the beer distributor and I start looking at what they have. Now, because I have to buy a case, I like picking up variety packs, and I did that today. And the variety pack I got was looked like a Halloween sampler from Magic Hat, and the beer of the case that I'm drinking now is the Magic Hat No. 9. I've had this beer lots and lots of times. We've gone through cases of this stuff. It's really good. It's made up in Vermont, I believe. Burlington, Vermont. Oh wow, beer doesn't get any better than that. It's got nice little ice chips floating in it, because I stuck a couple of bottles from the warm case in the freezer, and it's going down really good. The case here in Pennsylvania runs about $33 or something like that, 24 bottles, and I've got 4 6-packs of different stuff. So I went with the true and tested No. 9 just because I enjoy it, and it's going fairly well with the cigar. So I'm not quite sure what to say other than that. So let's end the cigar and drink pairing. I don't want to get too long and scare away the non-cigar smokers or the non-drinkers. So let's talk about the featured discussion topic of the episode. All right, well, it's time to talk about the featured topic of the episode, and I thought I would discuss crossbreed holsters. And I thought I would give you a little bit of review on the product, since I haven't done a review on my blog, and it's getting about time to review the product. I've had it for quite a while. I've been meaning to do this review for a little while, and because I was kind of doing this episode on the fly and I didn't have all my notes together, I just decided, you know what, let's just wing it and do the review of the Crossbreed holster. But what I have is the Crossbreed Supertuck Deluxe. Now, this holster is built to fit my Springfield XD subcompact in .40 Smith & Wesson. As you can see, there is no magazine in the gun, and we'll just do a little safety check. Nothing inside the chamber, so we know it's safe when I've got the gun in here. But the gun sits down inside the holster, and it's got a little bit of a snap, which doesn't allow the gun to ride up out of the holster. It takes a little bit of tugging. I mean, it's not hard or anything, but because of this holster being Kydex, I could adjust that with a hairdryer and a wet towel, I believe, to tighten the retention. But this holster, as you can see, it's black, it's dyed. This is the cowhide model, and it does not have the combat cut. So this is your basic crossbreed holster. Now, the only problem that I've run into with this holster so far is this cutout here. Now, I did not pay for the upgraded combat cut, which is a deeper cut so that there is a little bit less leather here. Now, the reason I didn't go with the combat cut is because I read that it can be a little uncomfortable because more of the pistol is exposed. Now, the problem that I'm experiencing is that once the gun is inside here and I've got this holster in my waistband, and when I practice drawing, my hand goes down over top of the grip, and as you can see, my thumb is binding on the leather. Now, by the time I've got this holster in place and cinched down with my belt, it takes a bit of effort to get my thumb down inside here to get a good grip on the gun and begin the draw. And sometimes I'll actually get a little bit of black dye on my knuckle from how much friction is here reaching in to grab the gun. Now, I can do the combat cut myself. I've read that I can just simply cut this out a little bit deeper. However, I'm really concerned with the edge treatment. I don't know what kind of edge that I'm going to get when I do that, so I'm really hesitant to start cutting into this holster. That is the only problem I've experienced with it so far. Now, as I mentioned, this is the cowhide model. There is also an upgraded horsehide, which is a denser material. It is natural, it's not dyed. Because it's a denser leather, it doesn't take dye real well. And I also like the fact that the black would probably blend in with my clothes a little better, and it would be less noticeable. Now, on the back of the holster, here are the rivets for the actual Kydex holster, but you've got a bunch of adjustment holes here and here, so that you can adjust these clips up and down. You can adjust the cant, how it sits in the pants, by raising this clip up and dropping this one down, or vice versa, however you want to do. I've got it sitting kind of flat on the second hole. It disappears below my belt line, and it works really well. One of the things that I read about this particular holster was that if you sweat a lot, you should buy the horsehide. Now, I sweat a lot, especially when I'm outside and kind of active. I start sweating, and once I actually sweated through this holster, and when I unholstered the gun after I was done mowing the lawn, I was wearing it to sweat and to break in the holster. As you can see, it's kind of molded to my shape, which is nice. But I actually sweat through the holster, and I had some sweat droplet on the frame of the gun. That kind of concerned me a little bit. So if I had to do it all over again, I would probably buy the combat cut, and I would buy the upgraded horsehide. Aside from that, it carries beautifully. It sits down inside my pants. It's really comfortable on my side. I have not had any problems. The gun just kind of disappears on me. It conceals really well. I can be active, and the gun doesn't poke me in the side or become uncomfortable. Before this, I actually had this really generic excuse me, holster from Midway USA for my Beretta, and it was hands down the worst holster I had ever wore, and I just hated it. And I think it was like $10 or something like that. But when it was time to get a real good quality holster, my options were kind of limited. I was looking at what everyone had to say on the forums, and I ended up going with the Crossbreed due to the reputation. Now, this holster is not cheap. I believe the base price is something like $60-some. And there are options. Again, the horsehide, I think, is plus $15. The combat cut is a couple of more dollars. You can get different clips which conceal better. I believe it comes with J-hooks, or I ordered J-hooks. I have a set, I just don't use them, which go behind the belt instead of over the belt like these clips do. But I've been really happy with the holster. It's kind of pricey, but again, I've been really happy with it, and the nice thing about it is it's tuckable, so I can wear a button-down shirt and it just disappears on me. Now, I had mentioned earlier that I listened to the Road Gunner podcast, and I had my eyes opened up to another holster manufacturer. Now, I use a Smith & Wesson M&P as a range gun, and it's what I use to shoot USPSA. I like the gun a whole lot, and I'm considering getting a holster to carry it. Now, when the Colster holsters, which look like a big giant paper plate with a Kydex holster riveted to it, I bought that on sale for $30-some on like a Black Friday sale on the website, and I've been considering carrying that gun from time to time just because I use it most often. And there are some times when I can wear the biggest of guns and it's just not going to be a real issue to conceal because of the clothing that I'm wearing. So I'm planning on cutting that holster down, doing what I need to do to make it work, and see how that carries. But again, back to the Road Gunner podcast, he did an interview with a gun shop owner who had mentioned these Theis holsters. Now, in the podcast, it was mentioned that the holsters were like half the price of Crossbreed. They have the combat cut built in and things like this. So I searched out the holster. I looked it up online, and it looks really good. It's not half the price of the Crossbreed, like mentioned by the interviewee, but it's much less. I think it's like $55, and you get the combat cut and things like that. So I may look into that option for my M&P. There's also Concealment Solutions, which I learned about on the Gun Dudes podcast, and they seem really, really happy with those holsters. They're a little bit more than the Theis, However, the only thing I don't like about those holsters, just from what I saw in pictures, is that the Kydex doesn't seem as molded. With this particular holster, you can see all the detail in the gun, because I think this is done with a press so that you get all of the profile of the gun showing up. The Concealment Solutions holsters don't appear to have all of that detail. Now, it's a minor issue, and it really shouldn't make much of a difference, especially when the holster's tucked down in your pants, but I don't know, when I see all that detail come through on the Crossbreed, I think quality, not so much as where it looks like Concealment Solutions is actually fitting it by hand, which is probably better off, but it's another holster manufacturer that I'm looking into trying. So far, I had the holster that I wear most often is this Crossbreed, and I'm extremely happy with it. And I would definitely recommend it to anyone in the market for a holster. However, I would probably recommend the Horsehide if you tend to sweat. And the combat cut for me is kind of a must. I really bind my thumb on the leather of the standard cut. So there is a little bit of opinion on what I think of the Crossbreed holster. Well, it's about time to close out the show, and at this point I just want to thank you for sitting through another episode of Shooting the Breeze. I really appreciate all the feedback that I've gotten. The comments that show up on YouTube as well as my personal blog have all been really positive. And one of the things that really blows my mind is, you know, when I started doing these videos initially, I was poking around for some feedback, and one of the common things that came up is, well, I see you're smoking that cigar, but you never talk about it in the show. And I responded, well, you know, I'll find a way to mix it in and try to do something to feature the cigar so that it's secondary to all the gun information. And I started doing the cigar and drink pairings, and they just seem to have worked. And that's what I've gotten the most feedback on. People, even non-smokers, seem to really like it, and I think that's fantastic. It's great promotion for Stogie Review, which I'm a co-founder of, and I really enjoy doing it. I'm not going to put the cigar down and do the podcast without, or try to hide it throughout the recording. The only thing that popped up was Jason Phelps from Empty Mags mentioned that in the audio-only version, every now and again I puff on the cigar in the middle of reading a news article or in the middle of talking, and it comes across as kind of awkward because there's just a pause of nothing. So in the audio podcast, I may need to go in and do some additional editing on the MP3 version to get that out of there, so that it's kind of seamless. So really, I'm really happy with the feedback I've gotten, especially with the cigar stuff. And Jason opened my eyes to a potential problem, because as it stands now, when this podcast is produced, I'm looking more at doing the video. I'm not too concerned with the audio. I only pull it out and make it available so that people can listen to it in their car or things like that. And I was asked to make an audio version, so I just extract the audio and publish it. I have done zero editing to it. So in the future, I may need to look into doing some editing of the audio. But again, I really appreciate all the feedback that I've gotten. I'm really happy with it. I'm ecstatic that I've made it to 5 episodes without having to push the podcast off or anything like that. I really enjoy doing it, and I hope to do many, many more. And the 35 of you that listened to episode 4, you deserve a pat on the back. I really appreciate that. Actually, I think it's a little more than 35, but I really appreciate all the mentions that I've gotten on other podcasts and a couple of other blogs. I really appreciate that. So, without dragging this out any further, if you have any questions or comments, you can do that on the comment section of the YouTube video or on my blog. If you'd like to send me an email or anything like that, there's a contact form on my website, waltonpa.com. All that email gets pushed right to my phone, so if you have a pressing question or something like that, I can get back to you fairly quickly. Or if you'd like something to be featured on the show, you can do it that way as well. You can also record an audio segment if you'd like to, or a video segment to be included in these videos, and you can email it to walt@waltonpa.com, and we'll do my best to make things work. So again, thank you for watching, and until next time, happy shooting, happy smoking, happy drinking, and I will catch you later. I should really have some kind of cool tagline, like coming at you with 80,000 pounds of concealed carry. That's really cool. Or if my mags were full, I'd be out shooting. That's cool too. I have nothing. Happy shooting, or happy catch you later. That's kind of weak. I need something.